In this week's In-Ear Insights, competitive analysis is nothing new. We have been doing competitive analysis since the first stall opened at a bazaar in the Middle East, and one guy's looking at the other guy's booth going, hey, those figs look better than mine. However, we are in a totally new environment now where you have massive databases, which are essentially what large language models are, with perfect memory, meaning that they know so much about an entire landscape. With that perspective, knowing that these things have perfect memory and a much bigger point of view than any one person's going to carry around. Katie, what do you think about how that changes competitive analysis? What do you think about how we should be thinking about these tools as a assistant to helping us be better at competitive analysis?
So John and I were talking about this at a very high level on last week's live stream. And the thing that struck me was that there is an opportunity to think about how do we include artificial intelligence as a set of data points in the competitive analysis. And so you have to step back first and figure out where artificial intelligence works in your organization and then what it's actually doing. And so, for example, at a very high level, let's say Trust Insights is generating 90% of their content using generative AI. Does our main competitor want to be ahead of us in terms of how much generative AI content they're creating, but not just how much they're creating, but how well it's performing? And so there's different things to think about in terms of where AI fits in. In terms of using these tools, I think that to start with, it's good to get sort of that high level summary. One of the things that's always been a struggle for me in terms of doing the internet research is really trying to figure out and summarize what another company does, because we all like to put the marketing jargon on a website, and sometimes what we do isn't super clear. We've been guilty of that before. So I can see using these tools to start to build out those portfolios of your major competitors. What do they do? How many employees do they have? What have their earnings calls say? But summarizing it all in one place versus trying to find it from 6 or 7 different outdated sources.
I think that's really important because when you think about it, they're synthesis tools, right? They can connect the dots in ways that we can't because, again, they have perfect memory and massive databases. And so one of the things that people struggle with competitive analysis is saying, well, what is the unique selling proposition of a company? And if you were to distill down, say, a company's LinkedIn posts and a company's website content, or at least the major page content thing, you could potentially get a distilled competitive statement that would articulate their unique selling proposition. And then you would perform the same exercise for yourself and say, well, how do these two things compare? Like, are we differentiated? And then also ask these tools, well, given these two things, A and B, how could we differentiate ourselves more? Because, again, part of the heart of competitive analysis is differentiation.
Well, and I feel like first that comes from knowing your brand and your business. And so what would you say, Chris, the Trust Insights differentiator is?
The main differentiator is that we solve problems with a combination of a human perspective, namely yours, and a whole bunch of machines, and which is very much my perspective. But we put these tools together in ways that other people don't know how to do, because it's kind of like I always go to cooking analogies. Like, yeah, a lot of people can make pizza. A lot of people can put together some dough and stuff like that. But not a lot of people, for example, can if they had to, repair their blender. And so if you're trying to make the tomato sauce for the pizza and you can't fix a broken blender, you got to go out and buy tomato sauce at the store. And now your pizza is no different than anyone else's because you're buying the same stuff out of a jar that everyone else is. Whereas for a company like Trust Insights, like, yeah, we can fix that. We can augment it. We can change it. We can find, using the 5P framework or user stories, the things that would differentiate our clients and then help them build the people the processes, and especially the platforms that will accentuate those differentiators in a way that off the shelf software and maybe off the shelf consulting won't do.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's interesting. I like that analogy because that really helps explain. Because yeah, at our core, we make pizza. All of our competitors make pizza. It's how we approach the making of the pizza, how hands-on we are versus like, well, we bought a frozen pizza. Now we're going to resell it to you like at a marked up price. Here's your frozen pizza. Ours is, we've made the dough by hand. We have our 20-year-old starter that we use. We've made the sauce by hand, and so here's all the machines that we used and the ingredients and how we've tweaked it over time, and so you're getting something customized to you versus what everybody else is getting off the shelf. And so when we think about using, so tell me more about this perfect memory from a machine learning model, because that's a new phrase for me. As of this recording, I haven't heard it described that way. So tell me more about what that actually means for someone who isn't in the large language model every single day.
Perfect memory means that the large models, particularly the very large models, like a GPT-4, for example, or a Llama 70B or a Claude 2, have so much information in them. They're these massive libraries of probabilities. And when you have near certain probabilities, there effectively are memories. So, for example, if I say, I pledge allegiance to the, what's the next word?
Barracuda. Flag.
The
You knew that was going to
more
happen.
the more probable something is, the more it functions like a memory, right? So if you remember, I mean, your average American reflexively can't help but to say flag in a lot of those circumstances, right? If I say God save the, depending on your age and generation, you'll say God save the Queen or God save the King. Most people still say God save the Queen. Again, just reflexive, it just happens because it's a memory, and that memory is based on statistical probability. We've seen it so many times, we've heard it so many times that we remember it like that. Machine learning models, especially large language models, have the same recall ability, right? If I say, tell me what you know about trustinsights.ai to Claude 2, it's seen enough of us and heard enough about enough of us that it can recall reasonably accurately who we are and what we are. Now, expand that to essentially the public internet, which is what a lot of these models are trained on. Because of this, they have the ability to recall with exceptional precision any of these statistical distributions. So, in the context of competitive analysis, they know us, they know our competitors, they know adjacent companies, they know companies all up and down our supply chain, and they can recall those details without having to go out and search for them because it's in the statistical matrix that makes them up. Yes, sometimes they get it wrong, the hallucinations, right, where they just make things up. But for the most part, and this has become more and more the case as these models get better and better, they have that perfect instant recall without having to go out and get more data. And that's what we mean when we talk about perfect memory for a large language model, and why they're so valuable for competitive analysis, because the tool doesn't have to go out and gather up stuff. It already knows everything about a space. You can ask it very complex questions about competitive analysis, like what's the differentiator in the unique selling proposition for this company versus this company with enterprise customers, and it can tie all those individual data points it knows together and give you a coherent answer.
Which makes sense, and I think that that's an incredibly useful use case for these tools. My question is, what happens when the data changes? So, for example, God save the Queen versus God save the King, like that's a change that happened recently. So, how often are these perfect memory models catching up? Conversely, what happens if, Trust Insights decides, you know what, we're going to stop offering data solutions, we're going to start offering Blender solutions, but we haven't put that on our website. How does this perfect memory model know that we've made that change? It doesn't, right?
It
If we
doesn't
didn't
right
put
now.
it.
it doesn't right now any more so than our audience would, right? If our audience still remembers us as that data company, like, oh, okay, we need to do a rebrand, and the same things we do to communicate to people, you have to communicate to machines. So you would have to go do press releases, have to go be a guest on podcasts. Hey, we're now a pizza company. Um, the models themselves change based on the frequency of updates that the model maker chooses to put out
Mm.
there. So, for example, GPT-4 still has not been updated since September 21. So it's coming up on 2 years old right now. Claude 2 is much newer than that. Claude 2 is tuned as of January 2023. So it has a more or a newer, sort of memory. The the technical way to work around some of that, if freshness is important, is to look at hybrid model systems. So Microsoft Bing, for example, uses GPT-4 as a language model, but it uses it for the language portion. It uses its own database for the data portion. The same is true for Google Bard. Google Bard uses Google's search engine results as the underlying database, and then uses its language model to return results. That's why the search engine based language interfaces are more accurate, because they're using a different data store. And so,
Mm.
from a competitive analysis perspective, if freshness is important in your industry, you'd want to choose your tools carefully to the tools that are that have an established track record, like search engines, of keeping up with what's going on.
But it sounds like the flip side of that is it's not enough for you and I to just decide that we're a pizza company and, like, tell our private social community, or, start talking about it with our clients. Like, we actually have to take action in a way that the machines can find the information. We need to put it out there. And I think that to me, that's the key of this particular episode is the machines can help with the competitive analysis, but if they don't have the information, then your competitive analysis is no better than anything else you could get from any other tool. And so if your company wants to stay up to date and fresh and make sure that the machines have the most, correct information, you need to make sure you're taking those steps. And it sounds like uh, that's a little bit different than we used to operate. Um, yeah.
That's correct. However, you can still use the capabilities of many of the tools, even if you have to provide some of the information yourself. Again, tools like Bard, for example, or tools like Claude 2 can accept a large quantity of information, and
Mhm.
then from that quantity of information, you can then have them perform specific tasks. So, a real good example would be UI UX design. To say, like, I want to know about the design of my homepage, right? And I want to know, I want to get a sense of, like, is it a good design or not? You
Mhm.
don't necessarily need to have the tool to know what that means in order to have it apply principles and things that it understands. Right? So you could take a snapshot, a screenshot of your homepage, put it into Google Bard and say, tell me what you see here. Tell me, is this good design or not? You could put a snapshot of a competitor's homepage and
Mm.
say, let's compare A to B, which has the better UI. And so these are all things that the tools have perfect memory for the task, even if they don't have the current information. You just have to provide the current information.
I'm wondering, so, when you ask the tool, like, is this a good design? That feels pretty subjective. Would you need to go deeper and define okay, so that was just for the sake of example. For those listening, Chris is nodding his head. Yes, you would need to go deeper to define what good means. Does it
Mm-hmm.
meet, you know, UX standards? Does it meet like the ADA standards? Does it meet, whatever? Or compared to my competitor's website, uh, where do they have advantages? Are their calls to action easier to find? Does their website more clearly define what they do? Um, are people can it go so far as to know? I'm guessing, I don't know. So the answer is probably it depends, but can these tools almost act like a Microsoft Clarity or a Hotjar and tell you, what parts of the website are most popular?
I think you would need assistance explaining what to look for, and image analysis is something that's still very, very, very fuzzy. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but it is possible to at least ask the question and see what it returns. So, for example, here is Google Bard. I'm going to go ahead and bring up Google Bard here. And I fed it a good chunk of the Trust Insights homepage. I had to black out the photos of people because Bard will reject anything that contains a human face. But I can say, I want to know user experience. Examine the attached screenshot of a corporate homepage and provide your analysis of its UI UX experience and make recommendations to increase both retention and conversion. It says the homepage is visually appealing, uses clear and concise color scheme, does a good job highlighting the benefits of Trust Insights Academy's program. The call to action buttons are clear and concise, but they could be made more prominent. For example, the button could be larger or have a different color. Add some more testimonials from satisfied customers. Offer a free trial of one of the programs. Create a blog or newsletter. Now, obviously, there's these are things that you would refine the prompt or have additional conversations. Like, yeah, it's already on there. The fact that it did not spot our blog means that it's not prominent enough in the image. It didn't know that there was a blog there. So even in this very simplistic example, we can see that it has knowledge of design and UX. It has knowledge of basic principles. We gave it very specific parameters. We want recommendations to increase retention and conversion, which is what we define with success. So not just good design, but does it help convert? And then it gave decent responses.
Interesting. Well, and so I can see this sort of opening the door for not just competitive analysis, but just your own QA. For those who don't know, QA stands for quality assurance. And so basically your quality control, quality assurance, which is a best practice for any project, not just a software project, basically someone double checking your work, making sure you've done your homework correctly and you've used the, process that has been outlined, you're getting the expected results. And so I could see saving a lot of time and headache where you're kind of guessing and hoping for the best when you create a new design, mocking it up and saying, hey, what are we missing here? So you could even feed the system your mock-ups before you implement them to say, like, what am I missing here?
You absolutely could. And this applies to, it's called style transfer. This applies to any kind of competitive analysis where you're looking at people's content to try and figure out what is about that content that's good and can I replicate it? So let me show you another example. This is a piece of software. It's a Python package called Matchering. What Matchering does in short is it takes a piece of audio, and this, I'll pull up a screenshot of this. It takes a piece of audio and it's so this is a one piece, and then here is a reference piece, right? Which is a different song, and then here is it takes your source piece, looks at the reference piece, and says, okay, I'm going to apply the same style of mastering to this audio to make it sound like the reference piece, right? So I can now, if I like the sound of like how a Taylor Swift song sounds, I can copy the style of it but with my own music, my own instruments, my own composition. So it's not copying the physical notes. It's just copying how it sounds in the ear. That's an example of style transfer. If you were a Twitch streamer or any live streamer or any other podcaster, maybe you saw something on NPR's Fresh Air. I could take a screenshot of you, Katie, right now, and I could take a screenshot of that and say, critique Katie's lighting design. What things could I do to make it look more like the NPR Fresh Air stage, to make it more visually appealing? So again, it's all competitive analysis. It's all looking at existing examples and saying, here's A, here's B. How could A become more like B if we know that B is what we want? As long as we as the subject matter experts understand that lighting is a differentiator, or a sound style is a differentiator, then we know what to ask for. The hard part for marketers and for everybody is having the subject matter expertise to know what to ask for.
Well, and this strikes me as really important because it's sort of the just because you could doesn't mean you should. So I think a lot of us, especially if we're just, if we're launching new services, if we're launching a new company, or if we're just sort of like trying to shake things up, we look at our competitors and go, oh, I like the look of that. Let me replicate it. But we don't stop to consider, is that the right move for us. And so using these tools to do that analysis of your competitors' website, of their services, of their content, of their pages, to see where they are not necessarily getting it right, and then bringing that information back to your own team to go, okay, so we really like the look of Chris Penn's website, but when we ran it through our tools, we found out that there were like 3 major, ADA violations, and, there was no call to action button. So before we go ahead and overhaul, our website to look exactly like his, let's make sure we're taking these things into consideration. And so I can definitely see where that is insanely useful for a competitive analysis.
Yes. And one of the things that we have kind of forgotten in the rush towards using generative AI for everything is that there's a lot of hidden factors, right? That classical machine learning, like regression analysis, might reveal. So let's say you wanted to be the most popular person on Instagram. You could download all the data and all the images and all the things of top Instagram influencers. When we've done this in the past and run a regression analysis on the visible factors, like, number of likes, number of comments, certain topics and things, the regression has always come out pretty weak. It's always come out like, on a 0 to 1 scale, where 1 is this is the thing and 0 is doesn't matter. Most of the time, those factors come out like a 0.2 to 0.3, not statistically significant to barely statistically significant. And that hints at the fact that there's stuff happening behind the scenes that we can't see, right? In your own company, there's a lot of things that happen behind closed doors that can influence, your success. For example, we have our colleague John. Every time we talk about trust insight marketing, we're not saying a thing about what John's doing behind closed doors. Nothing illegal, nothing unethical.
Oh, no, just normal business development stuff.
But he's really good at a specific style, and you can't see that from our public data.
And that goes back to my question about that perfect memory of it's perfect on what it knows.
Right.
But if it doesn't know that you've changed direction or you've launched a new service and just haven't put it on your website, then it doesn't matter.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So yeah, they are good at understanding disciplines. They are good at understanding specific tasks you want to ask about, but they don't know what they can't see, just like a human, right? There's no way we can know what's going on behind closed doors at Apple Computer, right? We can only know what they've talked about, or where there are leaks along their supply chain. So, but I would strongly encourage people to look at these tools as competitive analysis tools in your toolkit. So there's still a lot to be said for the classics, right? Doing regression analysis, gathering data from APIs and things. There's a ton to be said for that. The large language model is one more tool in the toolkit.
I have a lot of ideas of how to use this, so this is exciting for me.
It is exciting, and if it's exciting for you and you want to talk about it or ask questions, go to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers, our free Slack group with over 3,300 marketers who are all carefully keeping an eye on each other for competitive best practices. No, not really. They're answering each other's questions every single day. And if you've got a platform you would rather have our show on than this, go to trustinsights.ai/TI podcast, where you can find us on almost every channel. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time.